Hello, all you amazing women, and welcome to How to Feel Like a Midlife Goddess. With me, Amanda Ryder, nutritionist and author. Now, I call this podcast How to Feel Like a Midlife Goddess because, let's face it, so many of us don't feel like shining in midlife. We can be grappling with physical and psychological symptoms, which can lead to a real loss of confidence, and it can feel like you're really losing your identity. However, I believe it's possible for us all to feel good at this time of our lives. So each week, I'm going to be sharing with you my best nutrition and lifestyle advice, as well as interviewing expert speakers. And week by week, together, we will build upon a foundation of healthy, sustainable habits that will really benefit us and make all the difference to how we feel. So stay tuned, because this is your recipe for thriving at midlife and bringing out your inner goddess. Hello and welcome to Series 1, Episode 1 of How to Feel Like a Midlife Goddess. So in today's episode, I really want to give you some useful information that you can start using straight away. So today I'm going to talk about a framework for your diet, something that you can return to and think about when you're eating, rather than, a specific diet, which there are hundreds of, and they're not always sustainable. Now, I have written a book called Good For Menopause, and this book is all about that. It's about how to feel good, because there is so much negative energy around menopause, and we're all a little bit, scared of it, don't want to be associated with it. I know I certainly didn't want to be associated with being post-menopause, but here I am, and I do feel really great. But it hasn't always been like that. So just to give you a little bit of my background with the menopause. Not because I want to make this episode about me, so don't worry, we're going to get back to the Feel Good For and how you can use this in your life to feel good yourself, but more just to show you that, I'm recording this podcast for you as a nutritional therapist, but also as a midlife woman who wants to look after herself and be strong and vital as I go forward. So I started going through my perimenopause when I was about 47, and I started suffering with anxiety, very low mood, low self-esteem, feeling hot, especially when I was anxious, and I got frequent urinary tract infections, cystitis. And the thing was, I had no idea they were related to my declining hormones. So I was kind of beating myself up for feeling that way, and I kept it to myself, and I was trying to tough it out, which kind of only made matters worse. And it led me just to feel more and more isolated. It was really, really horrible. And I recall a really close friend that had known me for like over 10 years commented to me later when I was better that, at that time she really didn't recognize me, because I was so far from myself. And that was exactly how I felt on the inside. I just didn't want to be that person. Anyway, fortunately, I was able to pick myself up and climb out of that hole. And honestly, I have never looked back. I feel great these days with the odd off period that I've learned to lean into, tolerate, and just let it pass. That's just life, isn't it? And I've also learned that I need to ring fence my energy, give time to myself as well as to others, and understand my limitations. Just give myself every advantage in terms of my nutrition and my lifestyle habits. And also just accepting that I needed to, shift things in my life with this lower level of hormones. And, we all need to do that. We need to pay more attention to our health. So how did I do it? Well, that's what I'm going to be sharing with you in this series of podcasts. But the headlines are these. I got a personalized approach to my hormones, and I now take hormone replacement therapy. And I'm not saying everyone should do that. That's just what I do. I increase the amount of protein in my diet. I push my breakfast to have a slightly longer fast for about 3 or 4 days a week. So I was sort of having breakfast at like 11 or 12. I included the Feel Good For, which I'm going to talk about, on my plate every time I eat, nearly every time. I have less alcohol, I have less sugar, I've upped my greens, and I take magnesium. I have a lot less processed foods, And that means I'm getting seed oils out of my diet, which are very, very inflammatory. And that's a lot. And I know it's one thing knowing what you should do, and it's quite another doing it. So now I'm going to just talk to you about this Feel Good 4. And that's all I want you to think about for this episode, is how you can get the Feel Good 4 in your diet for most of your meals. So let me tell you about the Feel Good 4 way of eating. Now, like I said, this is just a brilliant way of organizing your diet, giving yourself a framework that's going to work for you as an individual. And it's all about ensuring you get enough protein. I'm going to tell you why you don't want to be afraid of fats, why it's important to have greens with your foods. And I talk about having a green drawer in your fridge, so you've always got greens available and you can just grab a handful. And I'm going to talk about how to upgrade your carbohydrates, because a lot of women are in midlife and beyond, they want to avoid carbohydrates altogether, but really carbohydrates can be very useful and provide the body with lots of fiber and make us feel a bit happier and contented. And who wants a diet with no carbohydrates? I know I don't. So let's get into the Feel Good 4. Why do we want to eat in the Feel Good 4 way and have protein, fats, greens, and carbohydrates on our plate at most meals? Well, we want to get control of our insulin. Insulin is a hormone that takes the glucose out of our blood and places it into our bloodstream. However, in midlife, we become less sensitive to insulin, and that's why you can suddenly start gaining weight when you haven't changed anything. However, eating in the Feel Good 4 way, we're going to avoid that. It's also good for bringing down inflammation and getting lots of, anti-inflammatory foods into your diet. It's going to be good for your joints, your muscle. As we get into midlife, we can lose muscle mass. It's known as sarcopenia. However, I work with lots of women that are hanging onto their muscle, no problem whatsoever. They're just doing the right things. So it is possible to have good muscle mass in midlife and beyond, and don't let anyone tell you any different. And then also, with the Feel Good 4, you're going to also be protecting your bones and avoiding osteoporosis, and that's sort of when your bones become too porous. And it's estimated that 1 in 2 women will suffer postmenopausal, but it's never too late to start taking care of your bones. So the Feel Good 4, we've got protein, we've got fats, we've got greens, and we've got complex carbohydrates. So let me start with protein. So we want to make sure that we've got protein on our plates with most of our meals. And why do we want this protein? Well, it's good for our blood sugar balancing. It helps us keep that insulin in check. And when you're eating, say, carbohydrates with protein takes a long time for your body to digest. Whereas carbohydrates can go through your digestive tract very quickly and be converted into glucose, which then gets shoved into your bloodstream, and your blood sugar can go up very quickly, and insulin follows that peak of blood sugar. And you when insulin is high, you get that message to store fat, which we really don't want in midlife. So protein is going to help us to balance our blood sugar. Instead of having peaks and troughs, we just have nice, rolling hills of blood sugar. It also turns off our hunger hormones, which is really important, that we feel, full. And then it's much easier. And I always say to women that, you really need to get control of your appetite, because if you can't get control of your appetite, then you're never going to be able to resist the chocolate and the crisps and the biscuits and the sweets. We are human beings, and we're hardwired to find food when we're hungry. So it's all about getting control. Then protein is really important for your bones, your muscles, your skin, your hair, your nails. It gives your body structure. It helps us to make neurotransmitters, those sort of chemical messengers in the brain, like dopamine and serotonin, these sort of feel-good neurotransmitters. We need it to make our hormones, our enzymes, our immune cells. So, literally everything. And also it's thermogenic, meaning that we use energy just to digest protein. So this thermogenesis, it basically creates heat. So we're actually using calories to process the protein that we've eaten. And then signs that you may be low in protein include low stamina, fatigue. I see a lot of women, when I look at their food plans and they don't have a lot of protein, they'll often say they're quite tired. sugar cravings, always hungry, not being able to go a few hours without eating, like hungry every 90 minutes. And as the blood sugar goes up, it goes down quite quickly. And then you're on this, 90-minute cycle where you're constantly hungry. Brittle hair, often getting sick, muscle loss, or just not great muscle mass. Poor skin, brittle nails, and slow healing can be some of the most obvious signs that you're low in protein. So how much protein do you need? Well, I believe because, as we get into midlife, so really that's over 40 and beyond, we need more protein because we just don't absorb it as well as we did in our 20s and 30s. Our bodies just can't kind of suck it in as well as it could. So we need to give our bodies a bit more, so it's got a bit more that it can play around with. So I'm working on about 1.1 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So for the average woman who is 11 stones 2 pounds, which works out as 72 kilos, if you times 72 kilos by 1.1 grams of protein, it comes out at 79.2 grams. So you're looking at 3 meals a day with about 26 grams of protein per meal. And, I often say to the women that I work with, really you're looking for about 25 to 30 grams, most women. And of course, we're all different, but, that's a really good start point. So how do we achieve 25 grams of protein? Well, really, we're looking at something like a 3-egg omelette with 50 grams of smoked salmon, a smoothie with 25 grams of protein added. And you can add protein. I use like silken tofu. I use pea protein, collagen powder, things like that. Grams of chicken breast, 200 grams of lentils or chickpeas, beans. These legumes, they're really fantastic for us because they contain protein and they contain carbohydrates. So they're really good food to have, and they've got lots of fibre and they keep us fuller for longer. But 200 grams of lentils, an egg, and 50 grams of smoked salmon is going to help you achieve about 25 grams of protein. 100 grams of white fish, half a block of tofu is about 25 grams of protein. And you can add tofu. If I'm adding it to a smoothie, I use silken tofu. However, if I'm adding it to stir fries and curries, I'd be using like a firm tofu, and you can get marinated tofu as well. A cup of steel cut oats with some kefir, some yogurt, some nuts and some milk. Add up to about 25 grams of protein. Like I said, add collagen powder. You can add collagen powder to your porridge, to your smoothies, even to your coffee. If you get a really good one, they're quite dissolvable. 100 grams of wild Alaskan salmon. Also, I'm not adverse to red meat. So if you can get grass-fed red meat, so like lamb and steak and venison. And I say grass-fed because when you have grass-fed meat, it has a better profile in terms of its fat, and it has more of the omega-3 fats rather than the omega-6s that we get from seed oils and grains. So if you think about chickens, they get, they're fed a lot of grains and seeds, so they have more omega-6s rather than omega-3s. Whereas wild fish, they have much more omega-3. So we want to bring up our level of omega-3s because they're nice anti-inflammatory fats. And I'm sure I'll talk about that in more detail. But my point is, if you're going for red meat, go for red meat that has been grass-fed. Nuts, seeds, cheese and yogurt, mix and match. Add these to your porridge and your smoothies because they all contain protein as well. So remember that adequate protein for women is going to help curb your cravings and give you more control between your meals. It's going to mean that you can go longer between your meals. And I always advocate, that we really want to be having 2 or 3 meals a day, rather than having 3 meals a day with a mid-morning snack and a mid-afternoon snack, because that is just going to be peaking your blood sugar all day long, which is not good for our health. Having adequate protein is also going to make us feel physically stronger, and we're going to notice the quality of our hair and our skin and our nails is all going to improve. And remember that I said we want to focus on it because we need more as we age. So that's number 1 of feel good about proteins. So feel good for second feel good factor is fats. And I want to talk about fats because a lot of us, if you were brought up in the 80s, like I was a teenager in the 80s, it was all about no fats, everything had to be low fat. If you ate too much fat, you were going to have a heart attack and just get really, really fat. And we now know that's not the case. And we all started eating more sugar. The food manufacturers started, replacing, getting rid of the fat and replacing it with sugar. And we just kind of got fatter and sicker. And if you think back to like your grandmother's or your mother's time when they were younger, and if you look back at the 50s and 60s, women had much slimmer waistlines. However, they weren't worrying about fat. They were eating the skin on chicken. They were eating lard and cooking in butter and, just enjoying fat in its sort of unadulterated way. However, they weren't, as overweight as we are these days. I mean, I think 60% of the UK population is either overweight or obese. So we do have a real problem. So my message here is fats don't make you fat or sick. And in fact, too much sugar, if you have too much sugar in your diet, it converts to fat very easily. So I think that those women in the 50s and 60s that were having, 3 sensible meals, eating fat, were just feeling fuller for longer and didn't have didn't need to snack all day long. And probably, snacking's been a more recent thing, hasn't it? Like in the last few decades, food manufacturers have encouraged us to snack in between meals. If you have the slightest pang of hunger, you should grab a snack. And really the only people that is benefiting are the food companies that are selling you lots of highly processed snacks. So we really want to get out of that. And we can get out of that by having proper meals with decent amounts of fat. Now, fats are needed for hormone synthesis. If you look at the structure of hormones and how hormones are made in the body, the first ingredient up here is cholesterol. And then all the hormones can be made from cholesterol, and it goes down to pregnenolone, and then it can be made into estrogen or progesterone or testosterone. And let's face it, in midlife, we still make hormones in our bodies, just don't make as much. So we do at least want to have the raw ingredients to be able to do that. So we need fats for hormone synthesis. We need fats because they're filling and they help curb our cravings, and they're going to give us more control. Fats turn off hunger hormones, and we make this hormone called cholecystokinin in our gut, also known as CCK, and that helps suppress our appetite and helps us feel calm and happy. And who doesn't want to feel calm and happy? So yes, please to that. Fats also help us absorb fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E and K. They're essential for joint health and for skin. And the right fats, like the omega-3s, are anti-inflammatory. And we need fats for healthy brain and our nervous system. So message here is don't be frightened of fats. So feel-good fats include oily fish, avocado, nuts and seeds, olives, eggs, extra virgin olive oil, chia seeds, flax seeds, dark chocolate even, red meat that's been grass-fed. And, really you want to be looking, you don't want that, but I personally believe, and there are so many viewpoints out there, how much fat you should eat. But I feel, that you really want to have, 2 or 3 tablespoons of an oil or of a fat on your plate at most times. And it's quite hard to translate that because obviously there's fat in meat and fish. But I think my message is don't be frightened of fat. Enjoy it as part of your meal and, in the normal way that you would eat. So number 3 of the feel good 4 is feel good about greens. Now, like I said earlier, I always have a drawer in my fridge full of greens, like bags of rocket and kale and chard and lettuce and whatever's in season. But the reason I want you to grab a handful of greens and add it to whatever you're eating is that, greens give you lots of vitamins and minerals. They're really nutritionally dense. They also help your body detoxify. We're constantly taking in toxins through what we breathe and what we eat. And there's certain chemicals in greens that help our liver work more efficiently. They're full of phytonutrients, and these are these plant chemicals that really help us to prevent disease. Greens also are great for bone health, and that's because they contain calcium, magnesium, and vitamin K. And again, we really want to think about our diet and how we can get enough of these micronutrients into our diet. They're good for helping us process hormones through the liver. especially things like cruciferous vegetables. And when I say cruciferous, I'm talking about broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, because these, again, they contain some chemicals called sulforaphane that can really be useful for helping us upregulate how the liver detoxifies hormones. So how can you do that? Well, you can just, you can have a green salad starter. That's really easy, just to put some, a nice salad together, like some rockets, some red onion, some olives, maybe some cucumber and a nice bit of olive oil, and just have that as your starter. You can also add greens to smoothies. Now, if you're new to smoothies, I'd recommend using spinach because it doesn't taste very strong. And then as you get better at it, you can add chard and kale, which has a slightly stronger flavour. You can saute greens. I love just starting with a few spring onions and then maybe a couple of garlic cloves chopped up, and I'll saute those in some olive oil rather, and then I'll add some kale and some broccoli and just let that cook down, maybe some leeks, whatever I've got really, just keep it super simple. And yeah, that can be a really lovely way of enjoying your greens. Like I said, green drawer, absolutely always have at least a few things in that green drawer that you can just grab. And sometimes I just pre-steam some broccoli or some courgettes, and I just kind of have those. So I can just add them to a salad and they're ready to go. And especially broccoli, if you're really hungry and you want to add something green, but you're in a hurry, if you've got some pre-steamed broccoli in your fridge, you can either just add it directly to the salad, or you can just cook it off in the oven for 10 minutes with a bit of olive oil, maybe some chilies, just to give it a lift. Just a really lovely way of enjoying broccoli. And then number 4 is feel good about carbohydrates. Now, a lot of women come to see me and they're not eating any carbohydrates. They're kind of eating fish, chicken and vegetables. And generally, they're not feeling that great. And they're not feeling that happy. They're not feeling that full. They're letting their diet dictate how they feel rather than eating for pleasure. And I think, we want to eat for pleasure. We want to eat because it's good for us. And we want to eat to give us control over our appetite. There's lots of reasons why we eat. But I feel with carbohydrates, all we need to do to carry on enjoying them is to ditch the simples. And by that, I mean the white rice, the white bread, the brown bread even. Bread converts very quickly in the body to glucose and raises our blood sugar. And I'm sure I'll do another podcast on blood sugar alone because it's such an important topic. And I have to say, when I started my journey as a nutritional therapist, one of the first things you learn is how to balance your blood sugar. And oh my God, it's just amazing. I wish I'd known that in my 20s and 30s, that balancing your blood sugar was going to not only affect your energy, that you've got nice stable energy, but also make your mood much more stable, and you'll be happier and calmer because it's gold when you've got it. Balancing your blood sugar makes you feel so good. So ditch the simples, the processed white kind of carbohydrates that are going to raise your blood sugar really quickly. And you want to embrace the complex carbohydrates. And those are the carbohydrates with more fiber that not only don't get into your bloodstream quite as quickly because they take longer to digest because they're full of fiber, but that lovely fiber is going to go on down to your colon and feed the beneficial gut bugs there that we all need to be daily feeding, if you like, to keep them nice and healthy. So complex carbohydrates, if you think of carbohydrates are in all vegetables. Root vegetables, anything that grows below the ground has slightly higher carbohydrates. Well, definitely has higher carbohydrates than anything that grows above the ground. We also want to be thinking about pulses, legumes, so chickpeas, lentils, beans. These are all under the legume umbrella. They're really, really good. So carbs to focus on. If I were to give you a list, it would be vegetables, so like your root vegetables, and then beans, chickpeas, lentils. And then root vegetables, I've really got into lately purple potatoes, which I get from Riverford in the UK, which is send a vegetable box each week. And purple potatoes are brilliant because they're purple, they've got lots of phytonutrients. And I don't know if you've heard of the blue zones, but in Okinawa, which is an island off, I think it's the south coast of Japan, but they have people there that live into their hundreds, are really healthy and fit, and this purple potato is a staple in their diet. So I'm keen on the purple potato. And squash can be really good. And then they're not actually grains, but like buckwheat and quinoa, they're more like seeds, but they've got, they do contain carbohydrates, but they also contain protein, and they also have a better sort of mineral profile. So buckwheat and quinoa can be a really good way of including carbohydrates in your diet. And then, I'm not against potatoes, but keep the skin on them. So if you're going to have you're going to have potatoes with your meal, have them in your, with the skins on, and maybe make them into wedges. That could be a really lovely way of enjoying them. Sweet potatoes, for me personally, sweet potatoes raise my blood sugar really quickly. So I tend to stay away from them these days, and I go more for my purple potatoes. But lovely natural carbohydrates is what you're looking for. And I'm not dissing rice. I'm not saying never have rice. I mean, I really believe that you want to enjoy your diet as well as it be a healthy diet. So I like basmati rice and brown rice, and I try and buy organic when I can. Things like grains are obviously quite small. They've got a big surface area, so they can take up a lot of pesticides. So it's best to buy organic if you can. And then also things like fruits, they're carbohydrates. And I really think about having fruits with a meal, a bit like the Mediterraneans do, a piece of fruit after your meal as your dessert. So how do you apply the Feel Good For to your diet? Well, here are some pointers, remembering that we are all individuals, and some of us will need more protein, less fats, more carbohydrates, vice versa. But like I said, these are the headlines to get you going. So you're looking for 1 portion of protein. You could use the size of your palm as a rough guide and an approximate measure, and that's your palm, not somebody else's. But like I said, you're looking for 25 to 30 grams of protein with most meals. For the fats, think about 1 to 2 tablespoons, and some fats will be found in protein like oily fish and eggs. But I'm thinking about dressings and adding olive oil to your plate. And then for your greens, you really want a portion of greens. You can either use a good handful as a measure, or a cup, or a quarter of your plate as a guideline. And then for carbohydrates, so remember, we're thinking about good carbs, good complex carbohydrates like colourful vegetables, legumes, so that's lentils, beans, chickpeas, sweet potatoes, squashes. And if you're having grains like rice or oats or pasta, then make it more like a quarter of your plate. And you can just start getting used to these and thinking about, does this plate of food have the Feel Good For in it? And to give you some Feel Good For meal examples, think about 2 to 3 eggs. That would be your protein. And then some complex carbohydrates would be like a piece of sourdough or rye bread with some mushrooms and tomatoes. And then your greens might be some sauteed spinach, and then your fats might be half an avocado. Then you could think about something like a tofu stir fry, which you could have brown rice, some vegetables such as peppers and spring onions. Your greens could be a handful of broccoli, and your fats could be some olive oil. Then you might think about another meal being a fillet of chicken or a chicken thigh, and you could have a tray of roasted vegetables, lots of lovely colourful vegetables. And then your greens could be some kale, or maybe some greens that you just throw in with the roasted vegetables, like some broccoli and some olive oil. You could also have something like smoked mackerel. That's quite a nice one to have at lunch with some, ready prepared cooked lentils, half an avocado, cucumber and some cherry tomatoes. And then your greens could be some rocket, and you could have a nice tahini dressing with that as your sort of fats. So that gives you some more ideas. In my book, Feel Good For Menopause, there's lots of tables with more ideas. But I hope that is enough to get you started. And remember what I said at the beginning of this podcast, eating healthily and keeping yourself healthy in a sustained way is a process that can be done gradually, and your diet will evolve over time. It's very hard to do everything that I've said today, but just try, maybe start with upping your protein, and when you've done that for a week or so and you've got used to that, you can really start thinking about the carbohydrates that you have and having that green drawer and thinking about lovely healthy fats. If you'd like to find out more about my approach, you can find me and lots of my simple, nutritious recipes demonstrated on Instagram at Amanda Ryder Nutrition, and that's Ryder with a Y. Or you can visit my website, www.amandaryder.co.uk. Or if you'd like a copy of my book, Feel Good for Menopause, you can find that on Amazon. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you could like, follow, or click the subscribe button. It will really help me grow the podcast and keep me going. So thank you. And of course, do get in touch. I'd always love to hear from you. So that leaves me to say I'm sending lots of love and light from my midlife goddess to yours. See you next week. Bye for now.